When you start watching the 2013 Evil Dead remake, it becomes obvious pretty quickly that it's going for a much different tone. The original film wasn't as overtly comedic as the sequels, but it was still fairly campy and over the top. I'd argue it more prioritizes being weird and suspenseful rather than being scary. The remake, on the other hand, plays itself a lot more seriously and is trying to be shocking and disturbing above all else.
You are all going to die tonight.
Some might not be on board for an Evil Dead movie that has such a radically different feel from the others, but I'm personally open to seeing an alternate take on the story. I think the change in tone is a perfectly valid way of giving the remake some worth in existing. But being worth existing is really only half the battle. Is it worth actually watching? Well, one thing I'll give the movie credit for is that I actually find the first act more engaging than the one from the original. One of my biggest problems with that film is that I feel like the action kinda takes a while to get going. The characters go to a cabin in the woods and have a relatively peaceful time, briefly possessed hand notwithstanding, and it's kind of a slow burn until the demons start showing up and shit starts hitting the fan.
As a Greek friend of mine once said, he said,
I don't necessarily have any problem with a horror movie starting off slow and building anticipation, and to the movie's credit, the first portion of it does help to establish the presence of the demons and foreshadow a lot of stuff that becomes relevant later. Like the bridge that's the only clear way in or out of the area, which later gets destroyed, or the keys above the cabin's front door that later gets stuck while a character is desperately trying to get inside. But my main issue with this first part is that since the movie isn't going for a particularly serious tone, the characters are made fairly simple, so it's not too upsetting to watch them get possessed and die. So there is a lot of hanging around with these deliberately one-note characters while you wait for the fun stuff to start. The remake, by comparison, actually does have some fairly interesting main characters with brother and sister David and Mia that do a better job at investing the audience. In this movie, the characters aren't just traveling to the cabin for fun, they're there so Mia can overcome her drug addiction.
I promise not to touch this shit ever again.
It's a really effective way of adding tension to the story during the early scenes in the movie, especially when Mia's withdrawal starts kicking in and she becomes more and more stressed and restless. And adding to that already tense situation is the fact that David has been distant from Mia for a significant amount of her life. Their mother was apparently mentally ill, which led to David leaving to avoid her, even leaving Mia to handle it all on her own at a very young age, and it's implied that that's what led her to drugs. So there is some deeper characterization here, as David is attempting to be a better brother and make amends with his sister due to his guilt. It leads to an interesting dynamic between the two, where Mia shows some resentment towards David, but is at least somewhat willing to meet him halfway when he shows he's trying to finally do right by her.
I'll be damned. Actually came.
And throughout the first act, the pressure between the two escalates as Mia's withdrawal gets worse and she tries to back out of going sober.
I'm sorry, but I have to get out of here right now. David, drive me home.
It puts David in a difficult position where he has to side against her to protect her, and she interprets it as him neglecting her all over again.
We've decided we're not going to take you back.
Mia, maybe they're right.
I am such an idiot. To think for once in my life, I could count on you.
These scenes are also elevated by Jane Levy's fantastic performance. She does a really good job in both the early stages of sobriety, where she has conflicting feelings towards David, and in the later moments where she captures the intense stress and fear of her situation really well.
You have to get me out of here.
The supporting characters are serviceable. I'd be surprised if someone told me that they were a highlight of the movie, but they do a fine enough job at contributing to Mia's sobriety and the subsequent possession storyline that I think they're perfectly adequate. And I think that's all that the movie really needs from them, considering it's more about David and Mia's arcs. As for the demonic possession plot, another thing I think the movie actually does better than the original is provide a better sense of dread. In the original film, the character's strategy for staying alive was just to wait out the night and find an escape in the morning. As a result of that, a lot of the breaks in between the scary moments don't really convey much sense of progression.
I don't think I can wait that long.
You have to. Go to bed and get some sleep, okay? Scott, we can't take Linda anywhere with a leg like that.
In the remake, though, the characters actually have a bit more agency as they're actively trying to find a solution to their problems. Throughout a lot of the movie, the characters are studying the Book of the Dead, which unleash the demons, to try to figure out how to undo Mia's possession. That also leads to debate amongst the characters, as one of the friends named Eric suggests killing her at the book's recommendation, which David naturally argues against since his ultimate goal in the first place was to help her.
I think we're gonna have to kill her.
We're not gonna fucking kill anybody!
Honestly, I can see why the director of this movie, Fede Alvarez, went on to direct Don't Breathe, since the sense of dread in that film was one of its greatest strengths. As for the movie's actual scares, I think... Real quick, if you're enjoying this video, consider subscribing to my Patreon. For £2 a month, you'll get your name in the credits of every video I release. For £4 a month, you'll get that, plus a verbal shout out at the end from me, and sneak peeks at my videos before they get released. And for £6 a month, you'll get all that, plus some bonus written content exclusive to Patreon. I just recently made a post discussing my thoughts on Shazam 2 and how I think it's a huge step down from the original.
I'm an idiot.
If that sounds like fun, consider checking out my Patreon in the description below. Now, back to the video. As for the movie's actual scares, I think most of them work to varying degrees, but there are some that I do kind of feel miss the mark. One of the more minor ones that I think is still worth mentioning is that they briefly recreate the demon POV shot from the original films, but I don't think it's quite as effective here. In the originals, the camera work had a lot of swerving and tilting and shaking, which conveyed a much more creepy and unnatural movement. On top of that, the sound design in these shots were a lot more echoey and muffled and unidentifiable, which made it seem a lot more otherworldly and uncanny. In the remake, the camera work is more steady, and the sound design just consists of whooshing and what I can only describe as a demonic grunting sound, which isn't nearly as unsettling or mysterious. Like I said, it's very brief, only really lasting a few seconds or so, but I think if you're going to pay tribute to an iconic part of a horror movie that you're remaking, it's worth doing properly. Aside from that, there are a few other references to the original film in the form of echoes of the original recorded dialogue playing when similar plot beats come up in the remake.
One by one we will take you. One we will take you. Bodily dismemberment. Bodily dismemberment.
Ordinarily, this is something I would roll my eyes at. Usually this type of thing comes across like the new version is just using the original as a crutch, despite the remake's story and continuity supposedly being independent from the source material, thus making these things seem out of place. I'm looking at you, DC, for playing the Christopher Reeve Superman theme over Henry Cavill.
Black Adam.
But in this case, I don't really mind. After all, the Evil Dead franchise has always been fairly loose in terms of continuity, so I think making subtle references like this are acceptable. Saying that though, I feel like the more significant problem with the movie's horror are the moments that stick a little too close to the original despite the different tone. Once Mia gets possessed, there are a lot of moments where she replicates stuff like the monstery voice and gleeful taunting of the other characters. Now, in the original, that kind of stuff worked because the rest of the movie was just as unrealistic and exaggerated.
You're not gonna leave me here, are you? Are you, ass?
But when the remake is mostly going for a more grounded and realistic story and atmosphere, it makes these elements just come across as silly and unfitting.
I can smell your filthy soul. Why don't you come down here so I can suck your cock, pretty boy?
Mia.
Mia's not here, you fucking idiot!
That also goes for some of the scares that feel like they're just being excessively loud and gory purely for the sake of it. They seem a little too unsubtle and in your face to be taken seriously in context of the rest of the movie. However, the film's general approach to horror is pretty good for the most part and adapts the gruesome style of the original film pretty well. Much like the rest of the film, the gore is taken in more of a realistic direction, and it pulls it off because it does look genuinely painful. When the characters get bludgeoned, it feels impactful. When the characters get sliced, it feels like their flesh is being torn into. It doesn't just feel weightless or like the blows are just effortlessly passing through them like butter. And there is a good amount of variety in the types of pain the characters go through, like scalding, cutting, impalement, biting, infection, parasites, burning, and blunt trauma. The greater emphasis on realism helps to make it feel uncomfortable to watch because it appears a lot closer to the types of pain that pretty much everyone has felt at some point. Albeit to a much lesser extent, I hope. And the variety of the types of pain we see helps to not make it feel repetitive. I will admit though that I still find myself preferring the horror from the original film because it had much more of a distinctive and engaging approach. It was more exaggerated and made the possessed characters look practically unrecognizable as humans, which made it more unique and memorable. To be honest, looking at the film nowadays, some of the dated effects actually kind of enhance the horror because of how strange it looks. The horror in the remake is comparatively a little more standard, but to be fair, it's very good by standards. Still, at the film's core, it's ultimately about David's character arc and trying to redeem himself as a brother. He debates with himself on whether it's for the best that he kills his possessed sister, made even more difficult after his history of not being there for her. There's even a really strong moment where the possessed Mia plays into his guilt.
Why do you hate me, David?
It's honestly the strongest moment from Mia's possession, since a lot of the more campy elements from before that didn't really fit are a lot more restrained. It's just Mia with a slightly distorted voice, very coldly and matter-of-factly calling David a bad brother.
You left me all alone with our sick mother, and I was just a kid.
For the tone of the story, it works a lot better than the extent that they take it to in some of the earlier scenes. But David ultimately manages to redeem himself by finding a very outside-the-box way of saving her. The Book of the Dead explains that the only way the demon can possibly be defeated is through Mia's death. David tries to resist it for a while, but eventually it seems as though he's accepted defeat as he elects to bury her, only to then dig her back up after she dies and manages to resuscitate her and find that the possession has been lifted. Despite being in such a dangerous and stressful situation where his life was at risk every second his sister still lived, he still went out of his way to save her by coming up with a solution that wasn't easy or immediately obvious.
Thanks for not leaving me, David.
And it doesn't just stop there. The two of them get attacked by another of their possessed friends, and David locks himself indoors with the demon, separating it from Mia, and then blows up the cabin with him inside, saving Mia in the process. It's a really strong way of wrapping up his redemption arc. He's gone from a guy who abandoned his sister for his own needs to sacrificing his own life to rescue her. But there's one final action scene before the end of the film. Mia is being chased down by the demon who has been terrorizing them throughout the film, and now she has to defeat it.
Enough of this shit.
This scene, I admittedly have kind of mixed feelings on. I won't deny that it's entertaining, it's nerve-wracking and fast-paced, and it's the most visually interesting part of the film. The scene is mostly this dark red from the blood raining down from the sky, which gets contrasted with this glowing red from the cabin burning down. I also really like this moment where Mia hides in the tool shed and starts looking for a weapon to defend herself. She reaches for a machete, before looking up and opting for a chainsaw, again paying tribute to the original trilogy.
Groovy.
But then the movie doesn't just forget about the machete as the demon picks it up and starts using it against her. And then the scene culminates with one final blaze of gory glory, with this awesome image of Mia sawing the demon's face in half, blood spraying everywhere while blood rains down with an inferno in the background. But I do think that from a story perspective, it feels a little lacking. It doesn't seem like this final action scene is here to resolve anything. I mean, the main plot of the movie is about trying to save Mia from her possession, and that's been accomplished. And it's not like it ties back into Mia's history of drug abuse. In fact, there isn't really any acknowledgement of her newfound sobriety after the conflict ends, which slightly undermines a lot of the first act. This all feels more like it's just there for the sake of having something big and climactic at the end of the movie, and it feels a little bit tacked on as a result. But like I said, I'd be lying if I called it bad. And that goes for the movie as a whole too. I mean, sure, it's not as good as the original Evil Dead, but I think it still takes it in an engaging new direction that makes it a worthwhile experience. If you enjoyed this video, then click the link in the description to join my Patreon. Thanks for watching.